Hey, well, first, I just want to say thanks for having me on. My privilege to be here, guys. And yeah, as you said, my name's Metaphysics Mike. I talk a lot about religion, philosophy, even some science on my channels. I do consider myself a Christian, though, to be honest. I mean, the term's loaded. It kind of depends on who you're talking to. If I was going to summarize, what I believe the Bible's true. I believe in keeping the law of God, which includes things like the holy days. I eat clean foods. But I also think that according to the New Testament, that many of the mainstream Christian things you hear are false, whether it's about Trinitarianism, whether it's about penal substitutionary atonement. So I just try to be a Christian after what the New Testament describes. And yeah, as you said, I've been talking a lot about the Trinity because that's been a crazy controversial doctrine, throughout history. And you can just see how it progressed, how it changed, how understandings evolved. And I think modern Christianity has been duped by this doctrine, as well as many others. So that's sort of just a summary on my belief. And yeah, I'm ready to get into it. Let's do it.
All right, fantastic. So, Mike, you just mentioned how you were and I know we're kind of breaking the script over here a little bit, but I just want to kind of get to know a little bit more on your background before we get into like the meat and potatoes of the issue. What did you start off as? Like, what kind of led you on this path? Did you start off as Roman Catholic? Were you more on the Orthodox side of things? What kind of got you into the whole Christianity phase, or rather the overarching, kind of Christian kind of title that you put on yourself?
It's a great question. So my father was a pastor of a non-denominational church. And so that's the environment that I grew up in. They were, you'd say, like charismatic, sort of apostolic, Pentecostal type non-denominational church. But I mean, eventually I had to just ask the question, where did denominations come from? Like, in fact, we aren't even a denomination. How did that happen? I realized I knew absolutely nothing about church history, right? The Bible is, we have it so nicely printed, all different versions, fancy Bible colors. In reality, it's an ancient historical text. It also has got to be read in a historical context. Like, these were just all things I realized I was ignorant of. So I sort of had faith, but I realized I was far ignorant in the actual roots, where it came from. And I mean, I guess I just wanted the truth. I was just like, I know God exists, right? I want to seek God. I also started looking into some other religious beliefs and texts, and I just sort of came to the conclusion that, yeah, I was wrong on a lot of different things. And I've just pretty much taken it from there. I try and take a lot of the heavy disagreements as a grain of salt. I try and not really be as judgmental as I think many people are towards me. I know that I have sinned. I'm in need of God's grace, man. Some of the way Christians treat you for not being a Trinitarian, etc. I think it's just all such a bad look. I really had to dive headfirst into all of this because I saw just how unfruitful it is, just how false it is, and the way it really affects human beings in a very deep way. I mean, I believe we're made in the image of God. To know God is to know yourself. The Trinity is downright confusing. Okay. If you're confused about God, your sense of self and identity can become confused. I think this doctrine is far more important than people realize. And so it needs to be addressed. And so that's why I've been really spearheading towards the Trinity, because I think it's a foundation of false control of the ancient Roman Catholic and Orthodox Church over what it means to like be a Christian and have faith. And so, yeah, I'm just going at it headstrong, doing my best. And yeah, that answers the question.
Solid. Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it. And that was a fantastic way to segue just into like, what exactly the Trinity is. So, Mike, like, when did you start to doubt the Trinity? Like, did it become, I know it wasn't probably foundational in your upbringing because you said you were from a non-denominational church, but like, when does the Trinity start to, kind of get brought into your mindset? And when do you start to, kind of question it a little bit deeper? And what made you question it deeper is more so the question I'm asking.
Yeah. So, I mean, the long story short is that I pursued education. I realized I was ignorant of all this stuff. I wanted to learn more about it. So I started, I've taken a bunch of different courses in systematic theology. I have a whole bunch of books, textbooks, commentary by historians, scholars, etc. I mean, as long as I can remember thinking about the Trinity, I was a Trinitarian. I didn't pursue education because I wanted to disprove the Trinity. I wanted to confirm that conviction and many others. But what I found out was that, like, this doctrine is shrouded in mystery. It's shrouded in the unexplainable. And, I have to say I'm not okay with that. That was a red flag to me because I don't think God is a God of confusion. How can you know God if God is, well, like his very essence is something that we can't even relate to at all? I don't think that it just didn't sit well with me, so I started to question from there. And then I realized this doctrine has been highly debated since its inception. I mean, we're talking thousands of years of people cannot get their story straight on really what even the Trinity is, let alone the specifics of perichoresis and the hypostatic union and all these big fancy words that people, learn and use and think they're smart. But in reality, I just think it's like a lot of vain philosophy that doesn't it has no practical value. It causes unjustified divide. And before I knew it, I was like, this is a problem. Like, we need to do something about this,
Right.
and I mean, in every Christian on TikTok who wants to be used by God is streaming Jesus as God. Like, you see it everywhere, by the way. Like, people, like ancient religious authorities, rule modern Christians by their ignorance, 100%. Much of the things the church fathers did, they did on some self-proclaimed authority, not because it was rational, not because it was logically coherent. All that's just an afterthought today. So you have all these guys who think they're arguing for a truth when really they're arguing for a dogma, for a tradition that's never properly been justified, right? And again, it just results in so much bad fruit in someone's life. So,
Right.
hey, I'm sorry if I talk too
No,
long.
you're
Feel
good,
free to
you're good,
shut me
you're
down, but
good.
like, yeah,
No,
that's
you're doing great, man. Honestly, we really appreciate it more than anything else. And I mean, educating people on the church fathers is like super important because then you get into issues like Origen, who's although he's deemed a heretic, his way of studying the Bible, gathering up text, his way of even reading the Bible is what was used by like a majority of church fathers in the first 3 centuries.
yeah.
So you have this like sort of disconnect between who we deem a heretic, on which church fathers we deem heretics, which church fathers we deem misguided, and then what we take from them. So even though someone can be declared a heretic, like for example, Origen, Tertullian, they're still taken from in some regards, whether it was like how they compiled text or how they read the Bible or how they compiled the stories of the New Testament. They're still taken from in some regards. They still have that existing. And I think Ahmed wanted to go ahead and ask a quick question. So go ahead, man.
Yeah. So the real reason I'm here is to talk about the hypostatic union, and which is a fancy word for the doctrine or the dogma, where this one person who is Jesus, he contains two natures, fully God and fully human, which is obviously, it would be a contradiction, right?
Yeah. So, there is some ancient texts talking about like a triad of sorts. You have people coming in early, like Justin Martyr, starting to use some language that hadn't really existed prior to them. You mentioned Origen. Origen as well wrote extensively about a lot of this, but they each describe some of the concepts we're going to discuss tonight in different ways, and they don't all fully really agree with each other. Origen, for example, says some pretty controversial things. He actually uses the term a second God to describe Jesus, which is pretty interesting. Origen was highly influential in a number of ways. He was one of the first to postulate, that God is incorporeal and he's pure actuality. And Origen, as well as Justin, they really borrowed from a lot of other religious ideas surrounding them, such as Platonism. That's just a fact. You got people like Augustine in his Confessions verbatim saying that like Christianity made sense in light of Platonism. So there's like a lot of different ideas coming in, but as the idea of who Jesus is, what he was, obviously we call this a Christology, the study of Christ, begins to develop. We begin to see some shifting of words. For example, hypostasis or person, and ousia, which is essence. And essentially, they postulated ideas that I'm going to claim are totally foreign to the Bible. So, for example, they would claim that Jesus fully subsists in and possesses this divine nature. And this is what they believe made him God. Like Trinitarians will say Jesus is God. Well, what do you mean? They'll say, well, we mean he possesses the divine nature, which is actually a little misleading because they don't say he possesses God, right? They say that he is God. It's, there's all sorts of interesting wordplay going on here, but essentially this cannot be true and certainly doesn't reflect what I believe the New Testament reveals for many reasons, because God has qualities and attributes which define who and what he is. Okay. For example, God is, as we understand it, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, even in a limited sense, some of this, what is logically possible. He can actualize all. I'm sure you guys are like aware of like really what I mean when omnipotence, etc.
Yeah.
But the point is that you can't be God if you don't possess these attributes. And so when they start saying things like Jesus is God, which would then later become more articulated and decided, quote, by authority officially at the Council of Nicaea, which is in 325 AD, right? And they essentially asserted that Christ is consubstantial with the Father, which, by the way, interesting, the word they used to say this was homoousios, which means of the same substance. Now, homoousios, people like Christopher Stead, scholars, in his work Divine Substance, have cataloged every use of the word homoousios prior to Nicaea. And guess what? It originates with the Gnostics. Okay. In fact, one of the first to use it was a Hermetic tractate named Poimandres. In fact, if anyone wants to look that up, it is crazy close to the Nicene Creed, the similar language here. So I actually think they borrowed the idea of consubstantiality to explain the relationship between the Son and the Father, ultimately back to Egyptian pagan religion, guys. Point blank. I mean, that's historically, there's no other explanation prior to them using it. And you have people, historians at the time, I believe it's Eusebius, who state that it was actually Constantine who suggested the use of homoousios to the creed. Many people don't know that. That's a historical fact. So anyways, essentially this idea of consubstantiality cannot be true for many reasons. For number one, Jesus is not equal with the Father. Jesus says that the Father is greater than I, verbatim, full stop. It should end right there. But I mean, there's many other things we can get into. God, again, possessing certain attributes, cannot be tempted. The scripture says that Jesus was tempted. If Jesus is God, right, that's a contradiction, right? God by nature is all-knowing. The scripture states explicitly that there were things Jesus did not know. And there's a bunch of fancy things Trinitarians will say to try and skew what places like Mark chapter 13 says, but they're wrong. Okay. He says verbatim, no one knows it. Not the angels, not the Son, but only the Father. It also says that he grew in wisdom and stature. Sorry, if you're omniscient, you can't grow in wisdom and stature. Okay. I mean, there's so many things here. God is immortal. By nature, he cannot die. Jesus died. Therefore, Jesus cannot be God. Right? God has no authority above him. Therefore, he does not submit to anybody, right? God does not pray to anything above himself. Jesus prayed to God. Jesus submitted to God. Therefore, Jesus cannot be God. It's extremely simple here. And I mean, it's all over the place. Jesus, it says that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That's what he said. Okay. If Jesus was God, he's the seat of ultimate authority, and therefore he cannot be given authority he already has. Like these, I could just go on and on. It's all throughout the text. You cannot understand the New Testament if Jesus is God in that story. Okay, it's just not it.
So kind of piggybacking off of that, right? In regards to the New Testament, what is your opinion about chapters in books like Hebrews chapter 1 through chapter 2, where it kind of establishes like the Son as God? Right. But in chapter 2, it then says that the Son loses his power and becomes lower than the angels.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on the validity of those texts, given your beliefs and given what you've researched?
It's a great question. So there's something I need to prerequisite my statement with. And that is that one thing is for sure. The Orthodox Trinitarian articulation of Trinitarianism, of the Hypostatic Union, did not exist at the time that the New Testament was written, number one. Okay. I mean, actually, we may disagree with that, you as Muslims. I don't know exactly when you would date the New Testament, but I believe that what we contain in the New Testament the oldest complete manuscripts, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, etc., they represent something that was an older tradition, something that existed and was written prior to them. And I mean, really, it wouldn't matter because they couldn't agree on the Trinity for hundreds and hundreds of more years anyway. But point being, that interpretation did not exist. So we cannot say that the writers of Hebrew meant to convey something that you can't actually understand unless you start to interpret it through the light of the councils, of the creeds, of the commentary by the church fathers. All that is later history. So to me, that's off the table right from the top. Even if I can't give you a good explanation, that cannot be it.
Got it. Okay.
But that said, I believe in what's called a wisdom or a logos Christology. And this, I think, is what the writers of the New Testament did understand. This is a context they had always understood. There were beings in Scripture who, I mean, essentially weren't real. I mean, wisdom was personified in the New Testament. They were used to that. Paul explicitly says that Christ is the wisdom of God. Like, that is, he's revealing his self-understanding as he views God in a wisdom Christology. So I think Christ pre-existed notionally in the mind, plans, and purposes of God. So the book of Hebrews, other certain statements, the I am statements, many of these other passages which Trinitarians use to support their position, I really think are just, they're expounding wisdom Christology, which again is totally foreign to any type of Trinitarian ideas. It didn't even exist yet.
You know, it's so funny you mentioned that too, because the first thing I thought of when you started your statement was Lady Wisdom in Proverbs chapter 8 in the Old Testament.
Exactly.
That's the first thing my mind went to. So it's really funny you mentioned that.
Yeah. So this is what the past, 2 to 5 videos on my TikTok have been about. I think that this is one of the easiest ways to show that the hypostatic union is in fact wrong. You do kind of have to know that in the Greek and in the Hebrew, the word God has a semantic range which can include beings other than the Most High God. Angels were considered gods, even human kings were called God. In Exodus chapter 7, God calls Moses Elohim. Quite interesting. So I just think that you also have to understand that the word God can have many different meanings. It doesn't just mean Orthodox Trinitarianism as defined by hundreds of years later in history, right? So the core problem with this belief is that it postulates that the one person of Christ can fully possess contradictory natures. So God by nature, again, possesses these attributes which define him. You can't be God and not possess these traits. Well, the thing about being a human is that we by nature don't. We don't possess the traits that constitute God. If we did, we'd just be God. We wouldn't be a human. That's kind of how that works, right? So to actually even say Jesus is a man is to give him attributes which totally eliminates the possibility of being God. And to me, when the writers of the New Testament preclude divine attributes to Christ, all of them are consistent with a single human nature. I mean, I don't think they can name one thing that's not possible as a true, genuine human being, right? Who is not God. I mean, whether it's being born of a virgin, whether it's performing miracles, being resurrected from the dead by God. I mean, all these traits he can have as a human. And to me, that's the whole story, guys. Like, as a Christian, to be honest with you, like, that was the point. God needed a human being to come down and fulfill the law because that's who the law was for. It was intended for mankind to live and be righteous. And so God needed a human being basically to come and make the difference that humans couldn't. Like, I believe Muslims also believe he was sinless. I think that's a true accomplishment that pleased God. And I think that was why God gave him a new role after the order of Melchizedek, which is just a priesthood. He mediates between us, between God and man is what that says, which is another reason why he can't be God. It says Jesus is the mediator between God and man. He cannot be God without assuming he's mediating for himself, right? So so that's pretty much the summary.
Yeah, for sure. Just as a quick clarification point. Muslims do believe Jesus was sinless, right? But that's something that he shares along with all the prophets, right? So in the Islamic belief, in the Islamic tradition, all prophets are sinless, right? Do they make mistakes? Yes. They're corrected by God, though. So when a prophet does make a mistake, they're immediately corrected by God. So there's no real sin that gets incurred there. So that's oftentimes, I'm not saying that you did that, by the way, but that's oftentimes like a common argument that gets brought up, like, oh, isn't Jesus sinless? That makes him better than all the other prophets in Islam. But no, like all the prophets in Islam were sinless, all the way from Adam all the way to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, Jesus, Abraham, all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, so I hear you, and I mean, I know it's not like the topic of this
No, I
discussion,
got you.
but yeah, but like my only point is again that just like I think even in the narrative, the whole idea was that he is a man. I mean, even the term "son of man" that was a term with a Second Temple period Judaic context, just meant man. He was a human being, right? So I think that's a part of the narrative. The whole idea of making him God was a later convention, right? That's foreign to the text.
And I wanted to bring this up earlier, actually, when you brought up Justin Martyr. But even in Justin Martyr's first apology, in chapters, I believe, 21 and 24, he refers to Jesus. He says, the same way that you believe the sons of Jupiter are God is the same way we believe of our Jesus Christ, right? So there's already this like sort of dichotomy where he's comparing Jesus, who's supposed to be fully God as per the Trinitarian belief, to these demigods, which are being thought of in pagan tradition. And I know that's kind of separate from what we were just talking about. It's just something I had in the back of my head that I wanted to think about. But yeah, just let's move on to the next topic, hopefully.
I do have one thing. So I know me and Ahmed, at least, Toji doesn't get super deep into like talk like debating about this particularly, but me and Ahmed have been talking to a lot of Christians, and I keep getting the same answer, which I feel like it's kind of like a cop-out answer. But anytime you press them on things like you brought up, like Luke 2:52, where Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, right? And their response is, it's a common one. I don't know, at least for me. They'll say that they'll say the one subject, the one person of Christ, he is growing in nature and wisdom, but only in respect to his one human nature. And this is somehow, I don't know, in their head at least, this is like solving the contradiction. I mean, have you heard that response?
Oh, of course, yeah, but it makes a blatant fallacy, which actually, Ahmed, we were debating with people in the chat on one of my videos about, because listen, a nature is an abstract thing. It can't actually take action like learn or grow in nature and stature, right? Like only a person can do that. So when they isolate the human nature and say it's doing something individually apart from the second nature, they're actually dividing personhood, and it would essentially necessitate a second person. And I mean, they of course deny this, but essentially they're just functional Nestorians, right? They are acting as though the natures can act independently, assuming two persons, and then just saying with their mouth, "Oh, well, there's only one." Like, okay, dude, like,
no,
it's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, I was thinking of that exact thing that you just mentioned, the functional historian thing, because I think was it your most recent video where you brought up the functional historianism point?
Yeah. Against John Steele.
Using a lot more often to keep in mind, because it just rolls off the tongue so well. It's like, okay, well, you're just a functional historianist. It rolls really well. But yeah, I mean, you get that so often where these people just, in their way to kind of like explain the incoherencies within the Trinity, they'll immediately just go, oh, well, it's not Jesus, the person who's dying on the cross, it's the human nature who's dying on the cross.
Yeah.
And it takes a couple of seconds for them to and most of them never realize this, unfortunately, but you take a second to think about it, like, okay, well, no, you're dividing up the natures. That's not how this works. It's the person who's dying on the cross. It's not just a nature. A nature doesn't die. A person dies. An agent of a nature dies. A person.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And, I think that all of these things really reveal a deeper problem with the hypostatic union that I think could be far more nefarious than people realize, because so there is this document produced through the Council of Chalcedon in I think the 5th century, and essentially they give all these details about the two natures of Christ, and this is called the Chalcedonian definition. Now, the definition verbatim states that these two natures exist inseparably. And this has always been interpreted as saying that they are not divided from each other, right? They're not separate from each other. They're inseparable. But then it also says things like, well, it exists inconfusedly. And people have always interpreted this as meaning that they don't mix. And so this is crazy, because that's actually a true dichotomy. Okay, if something is not divided or separate from each other, that's actually to imply that they are mixed. Like, that's what it means to say they're not divided. They are mixed. But when we say that something is not mixed, that is to say that they are divided and separate from each other. So you see, so the creed itself actually plays both sides of the philosophical fence. And this becomes extremely problematic when trying to speak with them, because they can just flip and flop. They can just play both roles. And what it does reveal to us, to people who are paying attention, is that it's completely arbitrary. Just at will, they can choose to ascribe some behavior of Christ to the human or divine nature, when in reality, there is no rhyme or reason in how they do that, right?
Mhm.
So that's as ancient as the belief itself. And I think that's quite nefarious, because what it forces people to do is stop thinking.
Mhm.
Stop thinking, right? That like, oh, wait a second, if they're not divided, then that means that they're like, no, just stop. It's not either. And I think that violates the law of non-contradiction, because it obviously can't be both. The law of excluded middle, you can't say that they're mixed and not mixed at the same time, but that's essentially what they do. So it's also why it's almost impossible to get anywhere with a Trinitarian at times, because there's nothing to shoot at. There's no absolute target. They can just go anywhere they want and throw a bunch of fancy words. And so I think that's like an inherent flaw in the doctrine that I think is quite sinister, folks. Like, that's just a mind game. They were just playing with people. I mean, they come behind closed doors, write up this text and say, everybody's got to believe this, right? And if you don't, we're going to cast you out the church. It's insane. And it's just totally incoherent. You can't even understand it. And that's somehow supposed to be support of it. Like, it's just God's just beyond us. Like, or you're just making stuff up as you go, right? So anyways, like, this is natural. If you want to make the claim that the human nature can be isolated in any way, it entails personhood. It just does, because a nature cannot take action individually, right? Only a person can do that. So to me, it just comes right down to it. Nestorianism, I mean, again, I think it's wrong, but it's entailed. It is necessitated by the claims Trinitarians make. And I'll go ahead and tell you this. This is how I do it in terms of the hypostasis between the persons. So I'll just ask people, are the persons distinct? Meaning they're not each other, right? Jesus is not the Father. They'll say yes. Okay, well, are the persons fully and equally God? They'll also say yes. Okay, so if the persons are distinct and the persons are fully God, and there's three of them, you have three gods by necessity, because the persons are God and they are distinct from each other. It's the same exact thing with the hypostatic union and functional Nestorianism. They accept the premises. Jesus can act individually as a human. They believe it is. Again, God doesn't die, only Jesus did that. So it is necessitated by their belief. They're essentially denying the conclusion. They're just in denial. They accept the premises, but then deny the conclusion that naturally follows.
Two minds and two wills. I don't know how it's not Nestorianism off rip, but Mike, honestly, what are your thoughts though when they say that the person of Christ has two minds, two sets of knowledge, and this one person contains these two sets of knowledges? Like, I don't know. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's only true depending on who you're talking to. Okay, there are also a ton of Trinitarians who say, no, he possessed one mind that's in unity with the same mind of the Father and Holy Spirit. So, like, there are other people who actually, they won't even, they
won't see through that BS.
No,
they just don't accept it. Okay.
Yeah.
They're
for sure.
sure.
I mean, but it's obviously ridiculous. It's obviously ridiculous, dude. Inspiring Philosophy made a comparison to a Marvel character. What was this character's name?
It was probably the Hulk.
Unbelievable, dude.
No, it was Night. What was it?
Moon Knight.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm a little bit of a comic nerd on this stuff,
dude.
Canonically, within the comics, Moon Knight is literally a schizophrenic.
Yes,
this is
he has personality disorder.
He's actually a schizophrenic.
Yes, unbelievable, and he's using that as an example. He's like, "This is how it works. God can be one-minded, right?"
Yeah,
a little person. So, like, again, same thing. A lot of this is just purely conceptual. It's purely philosophical. It has no basis in reality. Jesus has two wills. Like, it's just to try and solve one problem, and then that'll create a new one, and then they'll just flop back.
Matthew 26 is the will of the human, asking the Father to take this cup from him.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
The godly will is for him to commit suicide.
Yeah, right. Not my will, but your will be done. Like, wait a second. Do they have different wills? Like, it kind of sounds like they do. It's unbelievable.
Oh, I do want to ask, wait, because Ahmed doesn't like the example, of like the squared circle. Can this actually exist in reality? Saying like, one nature obviously has the properties of a square, one has the properties of a circle. Me and Ahmed disagree. I think it's like a pretty decent example, but Ahmed disagrees. Think it's a bad example. What are your thoughts?
Yeah.
I mean, I tend to use it. I think it's pretty good. I don't usually use it in terms of the hypostatic union, but I think it's great.
Yeah.
I think the
I
problem
think it's
is
a
we talk to Christians on TikTok a little bit too much, and a lot of times that like little analogy of the squared circle kind of just like fly over the head, and they'll immediately say, "Yes, there can be a squared circle."
Yeah.
This can exist."
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I think that's why Ahmed doesn't really like it that much because
I'm going to read a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas, and he says that the union between the divine nature and the human nature, it's not real, it's conceptional. So while Christ is outside in the earth doing jogging, he's eating food, doing miracles, the union between divinity and the humanity, it's not excremental. It doesn't leave your mind. It's only conceptual union.
here, let's briefly like what are the like just give me like the basic tenets of Diophysitism.
Pretty much the Diophysites, right? They believe in two natures of Christ, while the Miaphysites, they believe like these two natures, they unite excrementally. It's a composite nature, just one composite nature, while the Diophysites believe in two natures. Told you.
All right.
Okay.
Solid. Thank you everybody for watching. Big thanks to Mike for popping down to the Downtown Dawa channel. If you guys are interested, feel free to check him out on TikTok and YouTube. We're going to send his links in the bio down below. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us or Mike, just about anything in general. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is Downtown Dawa, and we'll catch you later.
Thanks for having me on.